When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Erudition Network. I appreciate you being here. Before we begin tonight, I just want to say thank you to all of those who messaged me, sent me requests for this particular episode, because I do think it's important, and I was going to talk about it. I wasn't going to necessarily talk about it as quickly. I tend to sometimes not do that, give it a moment, but I do understand, the importance of this subject. Let me tell you, before we begin, I do want you to know, we're going to do something that a lot of people that I've seen online don't do. We're going to slow it down. We're going to think about what we're talking about. We're going to look at the systems behind it, look at it polymathically. We're not going to racially overshoot or overreact. We're not going to put things into the context of it that don't make sense. We're going to think and not repeat something that we simply heard or something that is just been thrown out there. Because what we're about to cover today is one of those topics that people are misinforming folks because they speak with such confidence. But see, confidence doesn't equal understanding. Confidence just shows that a person feels enough confidence in themselves to say it. And that's not what we're here to do. If you're new to the program, my name is Eddie Phillips, and as I said, this is the Erudition Network. We don't deal in surface level history here. We break down history into systematic, polymathic, strategic ways. This is not a passive show. This is an interactive show. So I encourage you, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on YouTube, wherever you catch us, whether you're here, you come in for the live tonight, or you watching the recording of it on any of those social media channels. I want your interaction. I want you connecting, and I want you challenging what you think you know, as well as what you may have learned on here tonight. So I don't want to belabor it. So here's the question that people were asking me and what brought us here. Did the Southern Poverty Law Center fund hate groups? That's the question. Did they fund hate groups such as the Klan, the alt-right, or whatever? And I know many of you have heard it. You've seen it. It's been out there. Some of you actively believe that they did. And that's your opinion, and we'll get into that tonight. But before you lock into a set way of thinking, let me ask you something more important. Do you understand the system or the organization behind the claim? Be honest with yourself. Do you understand how informants have historically been used in civil rights cases in law enforcement, both local and federal. Do you understand how in the intelligence gathering method, how it works? Because if you don't understand those things, then you're going to be convinced to follow a certain frame of thought. Because see, there are certain environments that require informants in the first place. There are certain environments that require you to acquire those informants. And I think that's where a lot of pundits who have political and social and economic or whatever biases, that's where they're getting it wrong. And I'm not here to do that. I'm here to give you the facts and talk to you. And that's what we do. So we're going to go to today, and we're not going to argue the headlines. We're not going to argue the pundits. We're not going to argue the people who are doing this. What we're going to break down is step by step, historically, legally, psychologically, and structurally, how this all works and why it has to work that way. I'm going to ask you questions throughout this whole session, because that's the way that I want to do it. And I spend time going through and trying to think about these questions, and I want you to sit with them if you must and answer them if you feel you need to, but don't rush past them. The questions that we ask in this interactive are important. That's how we build this network. That's how we grow. So I don't want you to just rush past it. If a system exists where truth is hidden, where violence operates inside of different networks, and where people are afraid to speak openly, what kind of methods must you use in order to work through or against that system? And that's kind of where we're going to start with this. You know, you have to look at it. When a society allows violence, and we talked about this over the last couple of weeks, right? To hide behind local power, behind police, different interactive relationships, behind courts, behind churches, behind businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even when it hides behind family names and behind the idea of just being silent to get past, how exactly do you work through a system like that? How do you question this system? How do you get involved and try to take it down? How do you do those things? So for us, we got to look at it from that point of view. And we got to think about it carefully. A lot of people are reacting to the word informant as if that word automatically means corruption, deception, or that you supported a criminal system or yet you work with that system. But that is not historically accurate. That's punditry. That is socialistic. That is a emotional shortcut thinking that you're using a lot of times to disinform. And when we are dealing with American racial violence, emotional shortcut thinking is not where we want to go and not what we want to get lost in. So before we ask, rather the Southern Poverty Law Center use informants, we need to ask a deeper question. Why do civil rights groups, federal investigators, journalists, lawyers, watchdog groups, why do they ever need informants in the first place? That's the question beneath all of this talking. That's the question that needs to be asked. That question takes us into the machinery and the operation of this. An informant is a person who provides information to investigators. And it doesn't matter who they are, whether they be journalists, attorneys, whether they be law enforcement, whether they be civil rights organizations. You're trying to understand hidden activity. And sometimes Most times, informants are paid. Sometimes they're not. They're leveraged against by giving them the opportunity to stay free or whatever, right? Sometimes there are people in a dangerous organization, like say the mob or whatever, who decide to talk because they're afraid that if they don't talk, that they'll be put into a dangerous situation. The point is, an informant is not automatically proof that an organization is receiving information illegally, right? It's just an apparatus to use. Here's a question. If a person inside a violent group gives information to investigators, does that mean that the investigator created the violent group? If you go tell the police something that happened of a crime within your neighborhood, does that mean that the police created the crime? Or does it simply mean that the investigator found a way to see inside what really happened by getting testimony from you or whoever? That is where we have to look at this, because the public argument being pushed right now is too small. It says that the SPLC paid informants. Therefore, the SPLC funded hate. It has funded the KKK, funded the alt-right. But that statement collapses several different ways, right? It shows you that it's misleading in many ways. Paying a source for information is not the same as funding an ideology. Paying for intelligence is not the same as building the organization being observed. And if that were actually true, then every undercover investigation in America should stop right now. Every police investigation, every FBI investigation, everything should stop right now. And see, that's why we have to slow this down. That's why we have to push back against the narratives that are being put out here by pundits who don't really care to be accurate. The Southern Poverty Law Center was formally incorporated in 1971. It was incorporated by lawyers Morris Dees, Joseph Levin, and the irrefutable civil rights leader, Julian Bond. He served as the first president. Now, all of those origins matter because the SPLC was not born in an abstract, quiet way. It emerged in the aftermath of the civil rights movement of Dr. King and others, what we call the formal civil rights movement or the civil rights era. Legal victories were held. Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Acts, all of those things had been won, but they've been won on paper. But racial intimidation, exclusion, poverty, violence, criminality were still embedded in Southern life. They were still hurting people. So when you look at Julian Bond, he was not some ceremonial name. He had been part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a civil rights organizer. He was a Georgia legislator. And he was a public intellectual in the area of racism, having experienced it and seen it firsthand. He saw that there was a system of power. So when you talk about the SPLC's founding and its purpose, we're not talking about a group created merely to write press releases, merely to talk on a political standpoint. We're talking about lawyers and civil rights figures who were responding to a legal and social collapse in a landscape where Black people and poor people could not count on federal or state institutions, where they were still being pushed down, even though the law said that they should be held up. And that right there is the first part of this systematic way of looking at that. Civil rights did not end just because a law passed. Civil rights issues did not stop because Dr. King died. or was killed. In many places, the passage of law simply changed how people resisted. And we talked about this last week. And we're going to get into the second part of last week's conversation. I was going to do it today, but this is important. The resistance moved from open defiance, from open criminality to procedural obstruction, to ways to do it subtly. It moved from public mobs to private intimidation in jobs and companies and organizations. It moved from explicit segregation to coded economic retaliation and ways to keep you out of places. It moved from courthouse signs to courthouse discretion. Who you would convict and who you would not convict. It moved into hiring practices where you limited the amount of people who could be hired of color. It went into lending, zoning, schools, policies. It even went into jury rooms that convicted Black people disproportionately from others. So that makes you have to define another part of the system, the structural resistance. Structural resistance means a system may appear legally changed. It may appear wonderful, but the people who control that system still use policy, delay, racial custom, sometimes intimidation, and selective enforcement to preserve the older order in a new way. And that matters because the civil rights movement won landmark legal victories. But the community still had to live under the stress of local retaliation. And that stress was not only political. It wasn't only political. It was it was psychological. It was physiological. It was all rooted in the idea of keeping you down. It lived in the body and the mind and the experience. When Black families knew that reporting a crime could cost them their job, they didn't report. They stayed away from that. When a witness knew that testifying could get them killed in the South or even in the North, they weren't quick to go and talk about it. There was always the risk of death and harm. That's real. When a kid knew that a bomb could be placed in a church, which actually happened, that could kill you or your friends. When a worker knew that registering to vote could bring violence to his doorstep and get him killed. That wasn't just fear, that was sustained vigilance. And we talked about this over the last couple of episodes. Vigilance means that you have to remain alert at all times for the threat. And when vigilance becomes chronic, it affects everything. Your mental, your physiological, your sleep, your blood pressure, your emotional regulation, your decision making, how you even relate to your family, the trust within your family. This is one reason why racial terror cannot be fully understood only as a political state, as some pundits try to make it. It's about a public health issue, a mental health issue, a spiritual issue, a generational stress issue. We got to think about it polymathically. What does justice mean when people are forced to live in a state of alertness because the law may not protect them? And that is why informants matter. That is why the SPLC and other groups use informants, not because informants are always noble or moral. They're not. But because informant systems are always utilized and cleaned in a way where we know what's going on inside the organization. Does that mean that they are outwardly clean? Absolutely not. But in a world where violent networks hide, where witnesses are threatened under secrecy, where local power is compromised, and where criminal prosecution was failing all the time, information from the inside becomes one of the few ways to break into what's really going on, to stop the secrecy. And this is where you have to have an understanding of morality, method, and outcome. See, a method can be morally complicated, but still historically important. What does that mean? That means that the informant can be flawed. They could be part of the mob. They could be criminal. They could have killed and still provide accurate evidence because they're being leveraged to. Intelligence gathering can be uncomfortable, but it is still necessary when communities are facing organized violence. When we're telling people that stitches get stitches. If we do not separate these categories, we will confuse ourselves and we will allow ourselves to be manipulated by those who are out here telling outward lies. The SPLC is important because it became known for its legal cases against white supremacist groups, where they pulled and got informants in those groups. Anti-bias education, where they got teachers and people in education to talk about what was going on, and tracking extremist organizations across the board. Its most famous project is Klan's Watch, where it went in and went to dissect and find out how the Klan was operating in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s and some parts of the 2000s. It is an intelligence project where they went in to monitor violent extremist networks, where they documented their patterns, where they provided information to law enforcement and to the public, to journalists, to educators. They didn't keep that information. SPLC's own intelligence report described itself as a publication that was compiled by its intelligence project, and that its purpose was to make it available to educational and law enforcement use so that the public could know what's going on. But see, here's the thing. The SPLC did not invest into the idea of using information networks to expose just racial violence. It didn't create that. It didn't invent it. It invested in trying to understand it. It inherited a problem that existed even before the civil rights era. How do you uncover racial violence when the people committing it are protected by silence, community, law enforcement, and allowed to work with autonomy freely? We can look back even with Ida B. Wells and even further, and how all of those things were going on. Walter White having to go down to places where lynching was happening in the early 1900s, and because he could pass a white, he could get in to talk to him. But what happens when you don't have that ability? How do we get into this? And then once we ask the question of how do we nullify the secrecy, then the conversation changes. We stop asking childish questions. Did they fund the Klan? Did they ever pay someone? And we start asking adult historical questions. Like, what was the hidden system that they were trying to expose that was so dangerous that it may require them to spend money to convince this person to talk? What evidence was gathered? Who was protected? Who was unharmed? Who wasn't killed? Who was prosecuted? Who did they sue successfully to remove money, power, and land from people who would do harm? What organizations lost power? What communities gained equality, gained a sense of being safe? And more importantly, especially today, why are certain political voices trying to erase that history? Why are they trying to nullify the successes? This is where the financial piece comes in too. White supremacist violence was not only physical, it was economic. Violence was used to control labor, housing, education, voting. So legal responses had to become economic responses also. That is why civil litigation that the SPLC did became such a powerful weapon. If a criminal court failed, but a civic court, right, a civil court could still expose evidence, establish liability, win financial judgments, seize assets, and most importantly, weaken the organizations financially, that is important. A lot of us don't remember in the early 80s. I do, because I remember seeing this as a young boy. The Michael Donald case. It's one of the clearest examples of what we're talking about, and one of the clearest examples of how the SPLC got involved. Michael Donald was a black teenager. He was lynched in Mobile, Alabama in 1981. His mother became the plaintiff of a civil case against the United Klans of America and its related other KKK associates. The SPLC helped to challenge that case and identified the case and filed it in 1984 in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Alabama. And they won a verdict for the plaintiff in 1987, where she took over land and monies owned by the Klan. The case mattered, not only because her son was lynched and killed, but because it showed the difference between calling out hate, challenging it in federal court, and then dismantling, and the difference between dismantling the infrastructure. See, a lawsuit is not just speech. A lawsuit forces record. A lawsuit forces people to have to pay a fine. People have to give up something. You may not be able to prove conspiracy without connecting actors. You cannot connect actors with documents, witness, communication, without having insiders that can help you to connect those things. And you have to consider, if a violent organization operates through secrecy, how do you expose it? How do you get a decision like the Donald case without getting people and informants to tell you things about what the organization did? And this is what we're going. This is what we're talking about. And this is why the modern argument about the SPLC must be handled carefully, and why I'm spending the time in doing that. Current reporting says federal charges have, where they accuse the SPLC of improperly using donor funds to pay informants. And they say, oh, they were paying informants inside extremist groups without sufficient disclosure. But the SPLC has defended those payments as intelligence gathering methods, and how, for the better part of almost over 50 years, they've monitored extreme violence and shared that information with the very law enforcement groups that are now the FBI and the DOJ, who are now saying that they're complicit. Now, those are legal things that have to be judged through evidence, through due process, and everybody gets that in this country. But they shouldn't be judged through pundits and internet slogans and fallacies and lies that have nothing to do with that. Even if informants were paid, that fact alone does not answer the historical question that we just put. Why do you use informants? Were informants used to create the hate, or were they used to uncover networks that push the hate? And did they already exist? Were these organizations that used violence Did we use the informants to document the violence, how it was done, how it was used to manipulate public fear, how it was used to threaten? These things matter. These things matter. I posted a couple of days ago a book by a man named Vegas Tino. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go further. Tino went around with the alt-right and KKK and a lot of these these oppressive groups. And he's important because when a journalist or a writer embeds themselves, in these groups, these white nationalist networks, they're showing you how they work. And he's showing you that the SPLC didn't invent these networks. He's showing you that these networks had their own culture, their own ambitions, their own desires, their own rivalries, their own recruitment logic, their own grievances against the country, both psychological and hate-wise. And he's showing you this before any of these claims have ever come out. This is crucial because we have embedded reporting in a lot of parts of history. And they've always provided the legal evidence, the informant information that helps with the civil litigations that are used. They take the words of the people in the organization, their motivations. If you have learned anything so far, I want you to understand this. I want you to understand that the word informant cannot be treated like a magic word that ends the conversation with the SPLC. It can't be like, oh, well, that just proves that they funded the Klan. In American civil rights history, informants and insiders have always existed. Before we judge modern informant claims, before we jump on what is said, because people have a political motivation, we have to go back to the cases where secrecy protected killers, where local law failed victims, and where insider information helped break open civil rights murders that America wanted simply to forget. Like the Donald case, like Medgar Evers, and others, like the 3 civil rights workers. Because once you understand that history, the modern talking points start to look real different to you, and they stop making sense as to why people are saying these things. Because what we're dealing with right now are people just talking without understanding. So now that we understand how informants are used, I'm going to ask you something. If a society requires people to secretly pass information, if a society requires people to secretly pass information just to expose violence, what does that say about the system that violence is operating inside of? Why am I asking that? Because we have to move past that simplified modern conversation. We got to get past this punditry. We cannot talk about informants as if they are isolated tools, that they're financial tools. This is not history. That is reduction. What we're dealing with is a layered system that existed long before the Southern Poverty Law Center, long before it. And if we do not understand that system, then everything that follows will be misinterpreted. Everything that follows can be used to disinform, to put disinformation out there. So again, we have to look at that. When we talk about the civil rights era, most people are taught a moral story. They're taught that marches and speeches and courage, and eventually that all led to progress. And while those elements and those things are real, the Dr. Kings, the Fred Shuttlesworth, the Ralph Abernathy's, and on, they are incomplete, because beneath that moral story was a much harder reality. There were networks of racial resistance. There were power structures. There were coordinated efforts to maintain racial control. And these systems were designed to ensure that even when violence occurred, it could be hidden. Let me say that again. It could be hidden, denied. And when that was done, it could be left unpunished. And you have to ask yourself, how do you expose a system that is designed to protect villains? And not only the villains, also itself. What you have then is what is an intelligence war. See, the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, and other things were not simply groups acting randomly. They function in many regions as closed networks. A closed network is an important way to define this the right way. A closed network is a structure where information is controlled, access is limited, loyalty is enforced, and if you betray it, it's punished. It's not just the mob. That type of system does not operate in the open. It is clandestine. It operates through layers. It operates through silence. It operates through fear. Now think about what that means in practice. If a violent act occurs and people responsible are part of a closed network, and that network has relationships with local and federal institutions, and these institutions are then responsible for investigating the crimes that were committed by people within their own system, then the question becomes, where does accountability come from? Where does the accountability come from? And if you can't see that, where it can come from, now you see the problem. Because in many parts of the South, particularly in the 30s, 40s, and through parts of the 60s, there existed what is called a compromised civic environment. What does that mean? That means that the systems that were supposed to enforce the law were not neutral, right? They weren't neutral. Sometimes they were passive. Sometimes they were just by intimidation, by denial of jobs, and sometimes they were actively aligned with violence. And they were designed to restrain. And when you layer that on top of things like the White Citizens Council, these are not fringe actors. These are businessmen, politicians, bankers, educators, etc. They did not wear robes or hoods. They didn't always operate through overt violence. They operated through structure. They applied pressure through employment, through denial of services, through denial of housing, through credit, through access. Not just to blacks, but to whites also who didn't go along with them. And that makes us look at something really, really clearly. Economic coercion. Economic coercion is the act of using financial pressure to control behavior. It does not require physical violence. It affects you psychologically. It affects you physiologically, your place in your being, your mental. It requires you to be dependent. It requires you to be vulnerable. You want to survive, and your survival is tied to your compliance. And that is where we are. That's what we were dealing with, and to some extent, we still deal with today. And then you have to ask yourself something that many of us never consider. If a man knows that telling the truth about a crime can cost him his life, job, well-being, his family, everything, what does that truth cost him? Who's willing to die? Who's willing to lose everything? Because if that truth costs them everything, how often will people speak the truth? How often will people put themselves in that situation? And that is where silence that affected Black people for generations, that's where that silence comes from. That's why Jim Crow, Black codes, and everything could rule the United States. Because of that coercion, because of that forced silence. Because see, and this takes away from people who say, oh, well, everybody didn't believe in it. No, but they were forced to align with it. Because when the truth cannot be spoken openly, it must move quietly. It must move through trusted channels. It must move through individuals who are willing, for whatever reason, financially, through some sort of threat, but they are willing to pass information without exposing themselves completely to retaliation. That's the functional role of an informant. That's how they work in the environment, not as a creator of violence, not as a funder of violence, but as a breach in a system that depends on silence to survive. And if you want to go deeper into that, we often talk about law enforcement as if it's a singular unified force. That's not true either. Historically, that has not been a reality in any part of the country. There were federal authorities, and then there were local authorities, and relationships between the two that were not always aligned. The federal government, through agencies like the FBI, often had to step into cases where the local systems had allowed people to be hurt, killed, or destroyed. Or the local system was unwilling or unable to act impartially. But even that intervention was complicated because the FBI itself relied heavily on informants. Let me say that again. The FBI itself relied heavily on informants to understand what was happening inside these closed networks. Now, think about that. You had the director of the FBI the other day standing there talking about how they're going after the SPLC. But they use informants too. An informant inside a violent organization is not standing outside of danger. They are inside of it. They know how that closed system works. They are embedded within it. They're hearing the conversations. They're participating in the plans. They're witnessing the plans. They're observing behavior. And sometimes, as uncomfortable as it is for people to understand, they are also present when the violence occurs and even the murder. Which brings us to a point that I want to talk about. In 1965, after the Selma March, the murder of Viola Liuzzo, we're taught about that a little bit if you are taught Black history. She was killed in 1965, returning after the Selma campaign. She was driving people back and forth. And she's one of those individuals connected to the act of trying to do the moral civic thing. When she was killed, one of the people that was in the car with the Klansman that shot her dead was an FBI informant. I'm not making that up. That's real. Now stop there and think about that, because this is where shallow thinking needs to be thrown out the window. Does the presence of an informant mean that the violence was created by the entity receiving the information? He was an FBI informant. He was an FBI informant before he got in that car. He claims he didn't know that he thought they were just going to scare her, but they killed him. Does it mean that the entity had penetrated a violent network but could not fully control the behavior of the individual that was inside of it? Yes. But that informant then testified and told on those who were involved. Intelligence gathering is not the same as command and control. It does not mean that the violence can always be prevented. It doesn't mean you can always stop the person who's informing from doing what they may have done in the past. No, you're using them because they're embedded. Sometimes it means that violence can be understood, documented, and later prosecuted. That's the issue. And see, that distinction matters when we start making claims about who is responsible for what. The left is responsible for the can. Let's look at the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner in Mississippi. Those murders did not occur in isolation. They occurred within a closed system where local law enforcement was implicated and was shown, but they were part of it. This is not speculation. This is documented, verified history, facts. What does that mean? It means that the people responsible for investigating the crime were connected to the crime itself. If the system responsible for justice is compromised, where does justice come from? Why does it begin? And the answer historically is that it begins outside that system. When somebody outside needs the information, it begins with a federal or an intervention with someone. It begins with external pressure, and it begins when the information that comes from inside that closed network is relayed outside of what is hidden. This is a psychological and physiological dimension too, because this is where people often fail to really understand. Living under that kind of system is not a political condition. I'm tired of people putting this all in politics. This is not the right or the left. This is a mental, physical, psychological issue. It's a biological condition. When a community is exposed to unpredictable violence, when retaliation is possible at any time, when justice is uncertain, the human body does not remain neutral. It adapts. It enters a state of heightened awareness. We talked about this, vigilance. And we're seeing that not only with blacks, but also with whites. And when vigilance becomes chronic, it produces stress. It causes issues. It elevates cortisol. It disrupts things in your body. And we saw that. We're seeing that in the country. We see that historically. What does it mean when entire communities must live in that state of hypervigilance, whether they're black or white? And think about that really. What kind of decisions are people forced to make? What kind of things are they allowing themselves to live through? And then take that one step further. What kind of decisions are people forced to make when they must balance how they survive, the safety of their families and others? That's why informants exist. That's why the SPLC and others invest in informants. This is not a theoretical concept. This is not a political concept, but a human response to pressure. You also look at the South where they talk about faith. You can't understand the civil rights movement without understanding faith. Faith communities, particularly black churches during that time, were central to organizing, resisting, giving a moral framework. They carried the language of justice and they pushed that from Dr. King and others. It made it so that it became a moral tension, a moral obligation. If truth is a moral obligation, but speaking truth openly puts lives at risk, how does a person navigate that? As we asked earlier, how do you remain silent? Do you speak publicly? Do you risk destruction? That's where the idea of informant intersects with moral philosophy. It's not simply about deception. It is about navigating a world where direct truth-telling could get you killed. We had a closed network of violent actors. You had an economic system enforcing silence. You had compromised local institutions. You had federal agencies relying on inside information themselves. We have communities living under physiological and psychological stress. You have issues. And within that entire system, information becomes valuable. It's an asset, as we say in the intelligence field. It's not public information, it's hidden. So now we return to our central question. If this was the environment, if this was the system, is this why we need informants? Why did they use informants? Do you now understand what that meant? Do you understand what that required? Do you understand why it existed? Or are we going to go with what the pundits say and give it a surface layer understanding? Because once you understand that this was a system that needed to be gotten into, the conversations change. And you begin to take the next step in your understanding, your empirical knowledge. If the system was that deeply compromised, if violence could be hidden effectively, you needed something that could be able to get into that. And informants provided that. Work with the mob, still works with criminal groups. So you have to ask yourself, why did lawyers, civil rights leaders, and organizations, why did they realize that they had to form this? And once you get that, then you can stop going along with what the pundits out here are saying, because they're being disingenuous. The law is supposed to protect, but it often collapsed when it was needed the most. That's the environment people were living in, the secrecy, the networks, the pressure. If the law was there, if courts existed, if judges existed, if juries existed, if the police and everybody existed and they did the right thing, everything would be fine. But because they didn't, that's why justice didn't happen when Black people were killed, when they were tortured, when they were mutilated, burned, terrorized, targeted. Do you understand why it's needed? And I don't want you to think about that on the surface level. I want you to think about that seriously. I actually want you to think about it, because if we answer those questions slightly, we're not doing them service, but we need to answer them with a lot of thought and honestly, because then we can begin to understand why everything we are talking about, informants, intelligence, pundits, lawsuits, exposure, organizations, you'll understand why the Southern Poverty Law Center and others had to evolve the way they did. A legal system is only as strong as its willingness to act. I'll say it again. It's only as strong as its willingness to act. So you've had history, people will say, well, you passed the law, now enforce it. Remember prohibition and the scoff laws of prohibition. Not its ability, its willingness. Because the United States had laws against murder. It has had laws against many things. It has laws against conspiracy. It has laws against violence. But these laws were missing the enforcement. It has not been the issue of the absence of law. It's the issue of application. What does it mean when laws in the system exist, but is selectively applied? That is not a broken system in the sense of being non-functional. That is a system functioning in a biased way. That is what we call a selectively enforced system. And that distinction is important and it matters because, see, it tells us this was not chaos. This was a system and this was structure. And one of the clearest places, again, I mentioned it earlier briefly, is structure in the courtroom. Go back and look at the Medgar Evers case. Medgar Evers killer, Brian Della Beckwith. He forces us to look at this in a reality that many try to avoid. The evidence was there. People knew Della Beckwith. The motive was there. The act was clear, and everything before his bragging, all of that. And yet, in the 1960s, 2 trials ended without a conviction because all white juries could not agree to hold him accountable for viciously shooting a black man on his driveway like an animal in front of his family. It took decades. It took decades, not until 1994, that the evidence and everything was looked at and testimony emerged from informants and others, and he was fully convicted. He was an old man by then. He had lived his life. The gap ain't just time. The gap is the difference between a system unwilling to act and a system forced to confront itself. That's what it is. And if we sit with that, if we understand that, it's powerful. If justice can be delayed for 30 to 40 years in a murder case that was clear, what does that say about the reliability of the system at that time? What does it say about the reliability of our system even today? What message does that send to the community who's watching it happen, who's living through it? Because justice is not only outcomes, it's perception, it's how you see it. If people believe the system will not protect them, they begin to adjust their behavior. They begin to become cautious in the hypervigilance that we talked about earlier to survive. If you know that telling the truth in court may lead to justice, you'll tell that truth. But if you know that telling the truth in court may not lead to justice and may actually put you and your family in danger, are you going to tell that truth? Do you speak about it publicly? Because truth does not disappear. It is delayed, it is relocated, but it don't disappear. Facts are a stubborn thing. It moves from public testimony to private knowledge. It moves from open court to hidden channels. It moves from official records to whispered information, clandestine information. And that shift is exactly where informants begin to move and live and why they matter. In cases like the 3 civil rights workers, Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, we're not dealing with a situation where law enforcement simply failed to solve a crime. They were a part of it. And informants had to break that open. And if that is the case, then the entire concept of local justice collapses in on itself. And informants become important. And we can't look at it, well, you're financing the hate. If the police are compromised, the courts are unreliable, and the juries are biased, how do I get this information? That is a problem because you cannot prosecute what you cannot prove. You cannot prove what you cannot have access to. And you cannot access things without informants. Which means you have to use them. Information was the bottleneck. Information was the bottleneck. You weren't getting information, not morality, not the intention, not the law, information. The information was closed, and in a closed and hostile system, it was not freely given. It had to be gathered. It had to be coerced. It had to be pushed for. And then it had to be verified. And sometimes it had to be paid for because the risk of providing it was so high that the person that was going to provide it needed some reassurance that they could be safe, either by relocation or by finance. If a person risks their life to provide that information about a violent network, and then that information leads to exposure and possible justice, the act of compensating him for that risk or paying him, right, becomes something that you have to weigh. I think we're confusing the method of acquiring truth with the origin of violence itself. And that confusion is unnecessary because it's driving the modern narrative. History does not support that confusion. It does not. History shows that when systems fail, people adapt. And these adaptations are always clean. They are not always comfortable, but they most times are necessary. That's what it is. We have to give the public something that they can trust so they don't have the psychological and physiological problems that we talked about. Those neurobiological adaptations that are affecting all of us by living in a system that is lying. It creates long-term damage. And we have to expose it. We have to expose it. I know we don't have a lot of people in here tonight. I'm fine with that because I'm going to answer this because folks wanted an in-depth probe of this. And when you get on and you're watching this later, I want you to talk about it. Get in the comments. Gentleman said, Eddie, you put a few things out and people go crazy because the facts of it make people emotional. It makes them react. And I'm fine with that. If information is the only way in, if information is the only way to get what we need to stop these systems from working the way they do, if getting informants is important, why are we having people get out here and lie? An informant, in the context that we are discussing, is not always the original point of violence. They're not a creator of the ideology. They're not a financier of the movements. They're not a functional responder to that system. And most times, because they are informers, is because they don't feel comfortable with what's been happening. And they may have been pushed into that system. And so we have to look at that truthfully. Having an informant does not happen randomly. It is produced because the closed network, the economic coercion that we talked about, the fear, the selective enforcement of the law, and all of those things protect people. And when that informant is in that environment and realizes that they're an informant, their role becomes more clear. Their moral choice becomes more clear. It's not about participation in wrongdoing. It's about access to the hidden information and why it's important that I share this information. And you have to consider that, what that means to obtaining that information and getting that information. And it carries risk. It carries consequence. It carries cost. Some informants are killed. And that's not a theoretical, that's a physical death. They're killed to maintain the silence. They're killed because what they say may affect the overall system. They're not passive observers. We're talking about individuals operating under pressure, making decisions inside systems that offer no safe options if they betray it. And we're having this conversation tonight because it has to be precise that way, because the current narrative attempts to reduce this complexity into a single claim, a political claim. That if an organization uses or compensates informants, then it somehow is funding or supporting the system being observed. That is ridiculous. That claim only works if you ignore the distinction between gathering information and creating activity. Historically, the distinction has always been clear in law enforcement, in intelligence work, and investigative journalism, all the way back to the Revolutionary War, where there were informants and inside men. When federal agencies use informants to infiltrate organized crime, the payment of those informants, the relocation and giving the jobs and housing, was not interpreted as funding criminal enterprise. It was understood as a method of gaining access to information that was needed. So the question got to be asked, why is that distinction being blurred now? If the method had been historically accepted across multiple domains, what has changed in its interpretation? Why now are you interested in attacking the SPLC? The question is not found in method itself. The answer is found in the framing of the method. By collapsing the differences between information acquisition and operational support, we are able to create a narrative shift where we can disinform people. Where we can tell people lies and support using that politically to attack those who have actively tried to do things to make our environment and our country safer. The abstraction of the word informant removes the reality of the individuals involved. Informants are not interchangeable pieces in a system. They are people navigating environments where loyalty, fear, survival, and all those things I talked about are dangerous. Some are disillusioned participants, like I said. Some are folks who realize this is not what I signed up for. Some are those who no longer believe in the superiority or the ideal of that organization. Some have been embedded there on purpose as sources who remain within the network because they knew someone or they had family ties to it that they can get into the operational patterns and understanding. Each of these carries a different sets of motivations and risks, but they all share one common element: access to information that is otherwise hidden or denied. That access is important because it's information value. And that value is directly tied to the level of risk involved in obtaining it. And sometimes you got to pay for that risk. In a system where exposure leads to retaliation, you got to pay for that risk. It's not a moral endorsement. It's a structural reality. If the cost of providing information is high, then the system must account for that cost in some way. Rather through protection, rather through anonymity, rather do relocation, rather do legal consideration, rather do financial compensation. To ignore that dynamic is to create a fallacy, and I will even say it, a lie, for your own personal subjective needs. Now bring this back, because this is where I think a lot of people misunderstand too. Human beings, whether you know it or not, are not naturally inclined to complexity, to clandestine activity. When faced with layered systems and involved in competing interests and morality issues and ambiguity and imperfect methods, the mind looks for simplification. The mind wants to keep it simple. It looks for a way to reduce the complexity into a form that can be easily understood and communicated. And that reduction often takes the form of a slogan, a phrase, a meme. It provides one word, a clear, emotionally satisfying conclusion without engaging into the underlying structure that makes the conclusion questionable. So I'm not mad at all of you all who are following these pundits and their memes and their suggestions. But see, here's a problem with that simplification. It is that it replaces understanding with repetition. You say it and it is repeated and it goes out. It allows people to feel informed without actually being informed. And when that happens, when that disinformation spread, it begins to shape perception, not because it's accurate, but because it's easy to remember, repeat. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with. And when we consider the ethical dimension, because this is where we are, informant use is not without controversy. It's not without some ethical reservations, restriction here. It raises legitimate questions about boundaries, influence, and unintended consequences. There are historical examples of this, many that we've talked about, but they were informant systems nonetheless. They were abused and they were misused. So I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because particularly in programs like COINTELPRO by the FBI, which targeted Black political groups in ways that went beyond legitimate investigation and legal investigation. There are examples, and those must be acknowledged, because they remind us that these methods can be wrong. But acknowledging the complexity does not justify misrepresentation. It does not justify disinformation. The existence of ethical tension does not eliminate the need for the method and context. It does not take away the context. We are getting into a point where we just listen to people put slogans and thoughts out, and we go unchallenged. Informants don't have an easy answer, I'll tell you that, but it's a necessary one. It's a necessary one. We got to look at and question what's going on. It's about informants. And if informants are not the origin of violence, nor the creators of the ideology, nor the builders of those networks, but they're just people who are in response to that system, that closed, concealed, violent system, then why are they being framed as the problem? Why are they being used as a weapon to attack those who have taken the information from the informants and used it against those who are violent and evil? Even better question for you all who watch later. What happens when that framing is accepted? What happens when the pundits out here on the right who are saying these things, what happens when their framing is accepted? What happens when we remove the systems or the SPLC and others who are fighting against that system by giving them a false witness and removing them? What will happen to those who they have been able to protect? This is a deep subject, and I'm spitballing with you on, but I'm trying to let you know. The system, information breaks the silence. It breaks the silence. What actually happened in that hidden information? Who was actually involved in what things were done? Because see, here's what it's one thing to talk about systems, about pressure, about silence, about fear. It's one thing to talk about the networks that closed networks that protected themselves, but it's a whole nother thing entirely to see what occurs when that system is pierced, when information starts to flow out, when what was hidden becomes visible enough to act upon. That moment is where all of this pundit theory is out the window, because now consequences begin. Now people are held accountable. And if we're going to understand this conversation honestly, we have to ground it in real cases where that transition occurred. Earlier, we talked about Medgar Evers, right? It wasn't my intention to rush past it because it's important. It's an important point of historical reference, especially in what we're talking about tonight, because what happened in that case reflects the entire system we have just reflected on. Medgar was killed in 1963 in Mississippi. And that man we talked about earlier, Byron Della Beckwith, was arrested. He was brought in for trial. The evidence was present. He had bragged about doing it. The motive was clear. He didn't want, like the fact that Medgar was the head of the NAACP and that he was trying to get blacks to vote. The act itself was not in dispute. And yet the trials that were conducted in the 60s resulted in hung juries. And what that means is that in the legal system is, as it existed, especially at that time, he wasn't going to be held accountable. They couldn't produce accountability. So the question became, would he ever be held accountable? And for years, decades, he was not. So then my question to you is, what changed? Why did it take decades that resulted in a conviction in 1994? The information, the access to testimony, access to voices, all that suppression had been removed, had been ignored. People had outgrown it, moved away from it. The information did not emerge spontaneously. It came from individuals who were either young enough at the time to hear the things that were said, see the things that were done, and were no longer feeling under threat. And it connected to them. And they were willing over time to bring forward the evidence that had been hidden. There were people who did inform. So think about that. If the truth was always there, but it could not be used at the time because of all of the things we talked about earlier, what does that say about the system that was supposed to use it? And if the facts require time, pressure, and willingness of individuals to come forward who were within and informed about those closed networks, what role did those individuals play in the eventual outcome and convicting Medgar's killer and showing that justice will come at it, no matter how long it's delayed? Because see, that's where the part of an informant, right, is important. Broadly, it should be broadly understood. It should be a broad, across the board understanding that erasing that invisible nature is not a theory. It's a turning point. It's a place where you realize, oh, we no longer have to be afraid of this. We don't have to support this. Same things with the three civil rights workers in 1964, Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The FBI had to go through informants. The FBI had a file, and that's where the name Mississippi Burning comes from. It became known as the Mississippi Burning case. And that's not a distant historical moment. That's not been that long. But the structure was in place. The hidden system was in place. Those things we've been discussing. These three men were killed within that closed system, within that isolation. They were targeted. They were arrested. They were released. Then they were reacquired and then murdered in a coordinated act that involved both the Ku Klux Klan and law enforcement. And that's critical because it means that the system was not supposed to investigate the crime as part of the crime itself. Let me say that again. Investigate the crime as part of the crime itself. So now you got to ask yourself a question. Where's the real urgency? That's why it took them so long to find the bodies. If the investigators were involved, if the local system is compromised, then the community is also afraid, and it is also compromised. Only way to find out where they were is they had to get informants. who emerged through federal intervention, sustained pressure, sometimes payments, sometimes promises. They were either provided with these things to get them to be able to testify, to give information and inside knowledge. These cases were not solved simply because someone decided to enforce the law. They were solved because information moved from inside of those closed systems, because informants who were paid or given something did that. That is exactly what the SPLC has been doing. When we look at Viola Liuzzo in 1965, and as I told you, there was an FBI informant who connected her killers. He was in the car. When an informant is inside of a network that commits violence, he is important. He or she has to be protected. Does it mean that the informant created the violence, as I said earlier? No, but they're important to understanding the story. Because, see, this is where it becomes a difference between observation and control. And that's critical. Intelligence gathering provides access. It does not guarantee prevention. I'm going to tell you, for someone who's worked in that capacity for decades, it does not guarantee prevention. What we do is we try to show you what could and may happen by whatever materials we pull. And that distinction is often lost in these discussions that we're seeing right now, because we're attempting to assign responsibility without understanding the function. In the Liuzzo case, the presence of an informant contributed to identifying the perpetrators and securing convictions. But it also revealed the limits of intelligence when dealing with individuals who want to act violently, such as those who were in Charlottesville. On any way you look at it, it's dangerous. When you look at the situation with the Birmingham church bombing, because that's a situation where time, information, and accountability intersect in a way that should force us to think more carefully about how justice actually is utilized and it unfolds. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963 killed 4 young Black girls, and they were killed on purpose. And this shocked the nation, that someone would target children. Yet, immediate convictions did not follow. Information existed. They knew who the bombers were. They knew what the intentions were in these groups. But it didn't happen quickly. The FBI had gathered intelligence. They had informant-based insights into the Klan's activities. And yet, prosecutions were delayed for years, in some cases for decades. And why is that? Because of political considerations, because of ideology, because of evidentiary challenges, and because of the environment that was still existing in the South. When convictions of this started to occur in the 70s and the 90s, and even some part in the early 2000s, they were built on accumulated evidence, on witness testimony, on young and old people's testimony, and on information that had been preserved from other informants, from other people, and they were revisited and finally used. But for decades, these young girls' killing was left unanswered. And that distinction matters when we evaluate the role of an informant and how we utilize them. Informants don't prosecute cases. They do not control courts. They do not determine political will. They don't pay ideology. They provide access to information. I'm going to have to come back to this next week. I hope those of you who sent me messages about this, those of you who inquired about this, get something from this. Ask questions of what we covered within the last hour and a half. Drop it in a YouTube, drop it in Facebook, drop it on the shorts that we always create from this material. Answer the questions that I try to throw in here. Because, see, if the system, closed system, hid the facts, who brought it back to the light? What was used to bring it back to the light? Because it's not just about law. It's not just about courts. It's pressure, persistence. It's forcing people to do what is right. Once you see that clearly, the modern conversations, the memes, and all of this stuff, it should start to look very different to you. Because, see, we're not just dealing with abstract ideas. We're dealing with historical facts and functions that played a role in some of the most significant civil rights cases in American history. I've given you at least 4 tonight. And then we have to shift the questions around because the system requires us to look at the whole thing. But it has to shift naturally. And that's why, as I go through this and I talk about these things with you all, I try to put my note here, but it can go longer. Because, see, exposing a network, a structure, a system, especially when it produces violence, you really got to be serious and get into it. So I'm going to try to come back to this next week. And we'll get into more of what we're talking about here. That means I'm going to have to push my one section back even further, but that's fine. I think this is important. And I hope you all get something from it. And I hope that you interact with these questions. Even if you weren't here for the live tonight, interact with these questions. We need to be talking about this. We need to be talking about this. I do think it's important. Now, I want to say this before I close out here, and I want it to be clear. If there is any current legal allegations about donor disclosure, financial handling, or rather the SPLC properly represented how money was used, that's a different thing entirely. Those things should be examined through evidence and due process. But we shouldn't be putting out that the SPLC financed the KKK. Because, see, what the Justice Department actually alleges is that the SPLC secretly paid more than $3 million to informants connected to extremist groups. But we have already established tonight that paying informants does not mean you are sponsoring the system. And the SPLC leadership has denied wrongdoing and argued that those informants were used as they've always been used to monitor threats and protect people from violent extremism. Now, all that's a legal dispute. And legal disputes require evidence, not slogans, not pundits. But even if those payments occurred, payment does not automatically equal ideological funding. That is a lie. That is a lie put out here with people with their own machinations. That's the fallacy. That's the shortcut. That's why I'm breaking this down systematically. That is the piece they want you to swallow because it's convenient. As I said earlier, it's easy for you to digest without chewing into it. So ask yourself this as we close. If paying an informant automatically means funding the movement, that informant is inside, then what do we do with federal law enforcement? Do we stop them from doing that? What do we do with organized crime investigations? Do we stop them from using informants? What do we do with undercover terrorism cases? Do we stop using those informants? What do we do with journalists who embed research and pull primary and secondary sources? What about the civil rights lawyers who rely on insiders to expose the information in these closed networks? Do we throw all of that out? Do we throw out the whole history of intelligence gathering, whether it be military, federal, local, or whatever, because the method makes people uncomfortable? Were they uncomfortable when the White Citizens Council paid blacks to inform on Dr. King and others, their whereabouts and who they were, that could have actually and possibly in many cases led to their killing, assassination? Or do we evaluate the method by purpose, control, oversight, outcome, and facts? Because if we do that, that's where mature thinking begins. That's where non-biased thinking begins, because the United States has always used informants. Always. Why is that an issue now? The question is whether the method being used is being used to manufacture danger or expose danger. If someone wants to say it's manufactured danger, then they have to prove that. Show me where we manufactured white men walking with tiki torches. Tell me where we manufactured a white man running his car into a crowd of people and killing someone. That's not logical. That is insinuation dressed up as analysis, and it's too many people who are out here doing that. When we come back to the actual historical factual record, the SPLC's importance was not built on public relations alone. It was built on a legal model that used organized racist violence financially and legally. It used those things to pay and get informants to speak when it couldn't relocate them like the FBI does, when it couldn't coerce them to do it in any other way. It used that finances to get people to talk. The Michael Donald case showed that. In 1981, it showed that when his mother was able to be given all but Beulah Mae Donald, let's say her name, the United Klans of America was bankrupted and all of his assets transferred over to her. So ask yourself this: if an organization helps make violent networks pay financially, if it dismantles them, if it helps to expose them publicly, if it helps weaken their ability to operate, why would these networks and their sympathizers be resented? Why would we rewrite its role? What's the purpose of that? What's the political separatist purpose of that? Why would we try to make them to be a villain and not a watchdog group that exposes people? But see, that's what backlash does. Backlash is strategic. It does not always deny the event. A lot of times it just attacks the witness. Sometimes it attacks the investigator. Sometimes it attacks the lawyer. Sometimes it attacks the organization. Sometimes it attacks the method. And when all else fails, it tries to attack the moral framework itself. We didn't get into it, but I want you to go out, if you can, before we do next week's episode, go get Vegas Tinbow's book, Everything You Love Will Burn. It is not just a book about extremists. It is a field study of their behavior. He embedded himself among the KKK, the National Socialist Movement, and the Traditional Workers' Party, and many others. And he documented their movement before Charlottesville. What he documented was not a movement waiting for the SPLC to create it. He documented men and networks trying to grow, trying to recruit, trying to unify, trying to gain another sense of racist legitimacy. They were trying to move closer to power in the White House and in the government, and trying to turn grievance into movement identity. That is the part that a lot of these pundits need to understand, and a lot of them do. These groups had their own internal ambition. They had their own ideology. They had a hunger to be relevant. Turnold embedded himself in that organization for 6 years among 3 very extreme groups. That matters because it shows agency, it shows consideration, it shows documentation. It matters in our overall arcing conversation for this episode and next week's episode. So then the question becomes unavoidable. If he did that in his book, if the SPLC did it in their investigation, how is that wrong in exposing these people who wanted to harm and hurt and did harm and hurt? When people hear about supremacist violence, civil rights lawsuits, Klan cases, Charlottesville, Dylan Roof, Timothy McVeigh, the long history of racial terror, some of them do not process it as evidence about specific actors, systems, and ideologies. They process it as an accusation. They hear you are guilty, even when the argument is not saying that. They process it as white guilted. That's another form that they use. That is what I mean when I say this is false. It's false. It's false framing, and it needs to be confronted. It's being used as a shield. It's making the country more dangerous. White guilt, as pundits use it, often becomes a way to avoid difficult conversations and to get people who are doing violence, give them the excuse to continue. Guilt is attached to a specific reaction. Responsibility is attached to how we respond, how we tell the truth once we know it. None of this would be necessary if a man didn't bomb a church, if they didn't shoot a civil rights worker, if they didn't hang a young man. We have to be honest. If we know all of these things happen and we choose to defend the erasure, what does that make us? Does that make us moral? I want you all to consider all of these things as we go into next week. I thank you all for being with us tonight, because it's our goal to present these things as facts. That's what the Erudition Network is here to do. We're not here to give people a shallow history. And a lot of times it takes me a lot to do. This is not an easy thing to do it for an hour and a half. But I appreciate all of you who asked for it. We're here to teach the systems behind the headlines, the history, the facts, the psychological, the physiological, the effects, all of that. Because when people understand those systems, they are harder to manipulate. And when we look at and we pause and we see what's going on, we become harder to control. I got the final question for you is very simple. Do you want history that helps you think, or do you want memes as social functions to help somebody else manage what you are allowed to see and understand? That is why we study. That is why we read. That is why we go as deep as we did tonight. And that's why we refuse to let pundits and propagandists and revisionists and fear merchants and liars and fallacy pushers reduce a long civil rights group to a convenient lie. You all have a great night and rest of your weekend. I thank you for joining us tonight. You will be, at the end of this, there will be an advertisement for a book. Please feel free to go look that up on Amazon. And please share all of our shorts and everything else. Share that, put it out here, help us grow this network. If you want to help us financially, you see our ticker tape at the bottom, the Cash App at the Erudition Network. Join us, help us grow. We are growing, and I appreciate everyone who has been helping to do that. All right, I'm off my soapbox. This has been long, and I could have gone a little longer, but I'm going to separate it to next week. We got some other things to go over. I want to get into Vegas Dunbo's book more with you. Go get that book. It's not expensive. If you want to understand what this is about, and bring your questions. All right, everybody. Be blessed. Later.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.